The Strait of Hormuz transports about 20 million barrels a day. If these aren't reopened quickly, it will have a very serious effect globally. Europe is particularly vulnerable. Spain had a complete blackout in April last year. We had a near miss in January 2025. Since Labour came to power, they increased the windfall tax. They have banned new exploration drilling in the North Sea. It's worse than a mistake. I think it's a catastrophic error. What the Ayatollahs do is outside of our control, and that they are dangerous. They're dangerous to the globe. But I would put Ed Miliband higher because he's got his fingers in his ears and shouting la la la, and he won't listen to any criticism. We're going to have a crisis here of some sort of blackout or something before the political pressure is great enough to force a change.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. I am delighted to be joined today by David Turver, energy analyst and author of the Eigen Values Substack. Welcome to the show, David.
Well, thanks for having me, Fraser. It's great to be on.
We're talking at a time of potentially an impending energy crisis. The price of oil has shot over $100 a barrel. It's fallen back slightly since that peak earlier this week. But certainly, given the crisis in Iran, given the difficulty of shipping oil through the Strait of Hormuz, if the war carries on, potentially, the energy system, the global energy market is in a pretty perilous situation. David, I wonder if, first of all, before we get on to Britain in particular, could you just outline, what's going on in the energy markets, why the world is in such deep trouble at the moment?
Well, the Strait of Hormuz, when it's working properly, transports about 20 million barrels a day of oil, which is about a fifth of the global total. So if there's any disruption to that, then the world as a whole is short oil. And when, essentially when the price of any commodity goes up if supply is constrained. Now, in terms of the impact is probably likely to be most felt by China because it gets a lot of its oil from Iran. And while some of the Iranian boats the Iranian oil transport ships might be going through there, I think China is perhaps more worried than anyone. But in terms of actually getting the oil, but because the supply is constrained and the oil price has gone up, but that affects everyone. And we've seen our oil price go up. The other big concern is not just oil, but gas. So Qatar is a big supplier of liquid natural gas on big ships, and that supply is constrained too. And we've seen gas prices rise considerably as well. And that's bad, particularly for regions that are short gas, which is essentially Europe. Europe is particularly vulnerable because it produces very little gas its own. There's only sort of really Norway and Britain that produce gas, and neither of us are in the EU. So that gives a bit of a difficulty. And in fact, in preparation for this interview, I had a quick look at gas price last night. And in the run-up to all this, UK and European gas prices were about 3 times those of the US. But last night, they were more than 5 times those of the US. If you measure it on a standard basis, which is perhaps getting onto another subject. But it's true that the price of oil is pretty global. It sort of varies by grade. So we've got Brent crude, which typically trades a bit of a premium to American West Texas Intermediate. But gas is very much a regional market. And as we can see by those different prices, UK and EU prices are 5 times those of the US. US prices have gone up, but they're not going up by as much as they have in Europe. And there's all sorts of difficulties with storage here and storage in the EU because we've had cold snaps in winter, so we've used more gas. And now they need to refill it as we go into spring. And that, whilst we get some from our own supplies and some LNG from America, Europe gets quite a bit, and we get some from Qatar. And if that's constrained, then of course the price goes up. And then there's a bidding war between different countries that need gas from LNG. And I've seen reports that some ships that were due to come here, or come to Europe at least, have sort of like been outbid and sort of like turned around and gone somewhere else because someone else has bid a high price. I think we're in a very dangerous time, and if the Straits of Hormuz aren't reopened quickly, it will have a very serious effect globally.
And let's talk about Britain now. I mean, the UK has an oil and gas industry. There is, North Sea. There's potentially gas to be fracked in parts of Lancashire and parts of England. But the British government has essentially said we're not interested in doing that. It wouldn't help. It's a failing, dying industry. We're going to stick to net zero. Are they making a mistake? Should they not be pumping every available barrel of oil? Trying to get every possible liter of liquefied natural gas. What do you think?
I think it's worse than a mistake. I think it's a catastrophic error. I mean, it's either absolute stupidity or just crazy ideology. So let's just try and sort of like unpack this a little bit and separate oil from gas. So what have they done? Well, since Labour came to power, they increased the windfall tax on oil and gas companies and removed some of the allowances and extended its duration. So essentially the marginal rate of tax on these companies now is 78%, which makes it sort of like almost uneconomic to keep, well, makes it less economic to keep existing fields running. That's point one. Point two is they have essentially banned new exploration drilling in the North Sea. And then there's been court cases on things that had previously been approved, like Rosebank and Jackdaw, and they've been sort of like stymied from getting started. And they've ordered the previously fracked wells in Lancashire to be concreted over, and essentially banned, continued the moratorium and seeking an actual outright ban on fracking for gas onshore. So essentially they're cutting us off from hydrocarbons, from producing our own hydrocarbons. But even the Climate Change Committee recognizes that we will need gas in 2050. So that means that we're going to be reliant on imports. So again, let's separate between oil and gas. So if we started drilling again in the North Sea, we could discover more oil and gas. We could develop the fields that have been discovered already, and make it more economic to produce things that are already producing. Now, some of the critics say, well, we export this, and we're not going to impact the price of oil. I think it's unlikely that us producing more will impact the price of oil very much at all. At best, it'd be a few pence or cents a barrel. However, when did exports become a bad thing? And when did generating high-paid jobs become a bad thing? Because even if we're not exporting the oil, typically a lot of our oil gets exported to the continent and then goes in through a refinery there, and then we import the products, petrol, diesel, so on. And if we don't export the oil, we still have to import the products because people still want to drive their cars. So through restarting drilling in the North Sea, we'll create jobs, we'll generate taxes, and we'll have exports, which will help the trade deficit. So that's a good thing. It should be a good thing, and we should continue to do it. Gas is a slightly different kettle of fish because, as we discussed before, gas is a regional market, and even the fear of a reduction in supply has caused essentially gas prices to roughly double, maybe a little more, maybe a little bit less. So if we produced more, then gas price would at least be much more stable and would probably reduce too, and they would displace the imports of liquid natural gas. So liquid natural gas is always more expensive than something that we've produced ourselves or we get via a gas pipeline from Norway. So there will be a double benefit there in that gas prices would fall, and we'd have the jobs, and we'd have the taxes, and we may have we'd impact the trade deficit as well, because we would be displaced. At the very worst, we would be displacing imports, and if we could increase gas production enough, we might actually become a net exporter again, because there's an awful lot of gas resources, under Lincolnshire and so on. And there probably are some geological differences between here and the US and so on. But the thing I always fall back on is, if this drilling and fracking was going to be uneconomic, there will be no need to ban it. So those who are calling for a ban are, for some strange reason, fearful that we will become self-sufficient in gas, which is crazy when you think about it. And what gets mentioned very little is that there are also shale gas resources on the continent of Europe, and they banned it too. So if they want to become independent of Putin, then maybe start lifting some of those crazy regulations in Europe too.
And obviously, the other retort is, well, we've started down the path of renewables. Let's complete the energy transition. Isn't wind cheaper anyway? Isn't that the path to cheaper prices and energy security? I think you take a pretty dim view of that argument.
Yeah, even with gas prices inflated as they are at the moment, I looked it up before we came on. The day-ahead electricity price is £92 per megawatt hour. I also did an X post this morning looking at the subsidies for what's called contracts for difference in February, which was a record February month, and the average strike price of those is £150 per megawatt hour. That's active, so it's can't do the maths. 2/3 more expensive than gas-fired electricity. That gas-fired electricity also has a carbon tax associated with it. So if we got rid of the carbon tax and just had the gas, then that will be down at probably below £70 per megawatt hour, even at today's inflated gas prices. And the raw cost of the contracts for difference for the renewables doesn't represent the whole cost. So solar and wind are intermittent, so they need backup. Well, we're going to be paying about £2.5 billion in backup costs over the coming year, because the monthly cost of those have just gone up since October. The grid needs balancing, and we pay about £2.7 billion per year of that, of which probably about £2 billion is attributable to intermittent renewables, because the grid would need balancing even if they weren't there. So if you add all that up and sort of share it across the intermittent renewables, that adds about £33 per megawatt hour to the sort of like the raw cost. And then, because offshore wind farms in particular are hundreds of miles away from the source of demand, we need to expand the grid to connect them so that people can use the power that they generate. And Ofgem is talking about spending tens of billions, I think it's over 80 billion, between, I think it was 2025 and 2030, to do most of that cost is to expand the grid. Yes, there's a bit of upgrading of the grid that needs to happen because some of it's old and we need to replace transformers and that sort of thing. But that's relatively small beer compared to all of the costs of adding the extra transmission lines between here and Scotland and from Scotland, out to the coast and so on, and into East Anglia and all sorts of places. That's the big share of the cost, which of course should also be attributed to renewables. So when you add all that up, they are more expensive. Now, much, much more expensive. And then the argument is, oh, well, we've got some cheap renewables, from the latest allocation rounds and so on. And that's sort of partly true. So the cheapest round was allocations round 4, which is in 2022. But all of those contracts that were awarded have either been cancelled, for instance, Norfolk Boreas, or have been rebid at higher prices. Now, they're still relatively low, I think they run about an average of about £60 per megawatt hour at the moment. But again, you've got to add on all the on-cost of those things, and they're still more expensive than gas. And then allocation round 6 in 2024, there's a big project from Ørsted called Hormuz 4. That's been cancelled because it was uneconomic. And now they've allocated new projects in allocation round 7 that reported earlier this year. And those are at sort of like £95 per megawatt hour in 2026 prices, sorry. But they've extended the contracts out to 20 years. So, even the raw cost of those are more expensive than gas, including a carbon tax, with gas at elevated prices because there's a crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. So none of what they say makes any sense at all. It's complete rubbish. I'll be polite.
Is it fair to say that, renewables caught other problems as well? I mean, it seems strange for people to talk about an intermittent source as a means of getting energy security when, of course, it's not just the price, the rebalancing and things like that. Is there not also the risk even of blackouts potentially?
Well, yes, that's getting us onto a slightly different subject. So because these things need backing up, then because they are intermittent, we can't control where the wind blows and we can't control when the sun shines or when it's cloudy or whatever. Even Ed Miliband accepts that we need a fleet of gas-fired generators to back these up by his 2030 Clean Power Plan. The trouble is that the gas generators we got are aging, and I did a paper a little while ago where I sort of analysed the age of the fleet and said, well, okay, they are designed for a sort of like a 25 to 30 year life. What happens if we say we can extend them to 35 years? And of course, our nuclear power plants are falling off as well because they're old. What is our firm power capacity? And from 2027 onwards, it's not economic for people to build new ones because they won't be running very often, and they'd have to charge an exorbitant price to recover their capital because they might be only running 5% of the time, which is ridiculous. So the dash to renewables has made other forms of generation uneconomic because even though they're more expensive, the renewables get priority on the grid, which is a ridiculous state of affairs, really. You would struggle to design anything worse.
And we're in, potentially facing the second major energy shock in the past 5 years. Do the politicians never learn any lessons? It seems as if we have doubled down on past failures. We, after Ukraine, we didn't decide to get our energy security sorted out. We didn't explore the North Sea, things like that. And it seems now we are again doubling down on failure rather than looking to think about the next shock, protecting ourselves against the next shock. I mean, what might a sane energy policy look like, given that we are starting from where we are in Britain?
On the supply side, then we need to lift the effective ban on fracking. We need to cut taxes for North Sea operators, and we need to lift the ban on drilling in the North Sea for exploration and development, and fast track Jackdaw and Rosebank. Then on the demand side, I think we need to cut carbon taxes. We need to cut the renewable obligation subsidies. We need to be a little bit careful about how we do that because that will lead to some decommissioning liabilities, which they're probably not providing for properly. We need to rebuild firm power. Now, the trouble is that's going to take quite a long time. So there's about an 8-year lead time on new gas-fired generators or something, and there will be a crisis before then, which is why I've got a slightly controversial view that actually I think we'll be forced back to either reopening if we can or building new coal power stations because I think they've got a shorter lead time. But the nature of our as we discussed, the aging nature of our firm power capacity is such that we're just going to need that. It's probably going to take a crisis for the government to realise, but they've had sufficient wake-up calls. So last year we had a near miss in January 2025. Catherine Porter, one of my contacts, has written extensively about that. I wrote about it a bit too. Of course, Spain had a complete blackout in April last year because they had too much solar on the grid and it was too unstable. So in a rational world, that would cause people to at least have a pause for thought. But Ed Miliband has got his fingers in his ears and shouting la la la, and he won't listen to any criticism. So I fear that we're going to have a crisis here of some sort of blackout or something before the political pressure is great enough to force a change.
And final question, maybe a slightly silly question. Who do you think is more dangerous to UK energy security? Is it the Ayatollahs blowing up the Qatari gas plants, or is it Ed Miliband concreting over our fracking wells?
We could be in greater control of our own destiny, and Ed Miliband is an obstacle to us doing that. What the Ayatollahs do is outside of our control, and they are dangerous. They're dangerous to the globe. But I would put Ed Miliband ranking higher because he's not doing what could be done to help us control our own destiny.
David Turver, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.